Do you remember the story of Cain and Abel from the book of Genesis, chapters 4 and 5? We're going to revisit that today, because there are some truths in this story that we need to understand and apply if we want to live better lives. So let's start by looking at the text and seeing what it says. In the text, we see two brothers who are very different. They both make offerings to God, but they each come with a different attitude. So let's look at the differences between these two brothers and the offerings that they gave. First of all, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and he offered God one of the firstborn lambs from his flock without blemish. Now, on the other hand, Cain was a tiller of the ground, a farmer, if you will. He brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. When you look at these offerings, it seems like God actually preferred Abel's offering over Cain's. You know, an animal sacrifice is more valuable than some fruit from the garden. But really, that's not what this story is about. It's not about the size or the value of the gift that you bring to God. This story is about something else entirely. It's about the heart behind the gift. And here's the problem. The Bible tells us in verse 3 that in the same way, both of these offerings were an act of worship. Both of these brothers came to God with offerings, but this is what's important. In the same way, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for the offering that Cain had brought. And this is important to note. Why did God not have regard for Cain's offering? It wasn't because it was a lesser gift. It wasn't because he was a lesser person, but it was because of the heart that was behind the gift. Now, in verses 5 to 7, we see that God is actually grieved by the heart of Cain. He's sad about the heart of Cain. So God asks him, "Why are you so upset? Why is your face downcast?" And then Cain tries to play innocent, and he says, "I don't know. I don't have a clue. I'm not angry." But God says, "You must not be, but you are, and your wickedness is about to come out of these things. If you do not do right, sin is crouching at the door as an unreasoning beast, ready to be master." And this is the first time in Scripture where we see a reference to sin as being a crouching beast. Sin will wait patiently until it gets its opportunity. It's waiting for you and me to let our guard down, so that it can attack and devour us. And so many times in our lives, we will let our guard down and will allow sin to master us. And how does it happen? It happens when we compare ourselves to other people. Now, compare this with another passage in Scripture, James chapter 1, verse 14 to 15. It says, "But each one is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." Now notice the word tempted in James, because it talks about being tempted, being lured, and being enticed. That's the same word used in the original language, in the Greek language, as the word used in Genesis, talking about Cain being enticed by his own desires. So we all will be tempted in our life, and that temptation will come through our own desires, our own wants, our own needs, our own comparisons. And in this case, the comparison led to destruction. When Cain compared himself to his brother and saw that his brother's offering was more acceptable to God than his own, what happened? Well, he became angry. And then what did that anger cause? It caused bitterness. And then that bitterness caused him to take a murderous action. So we see that comparison leading to anger, which then resulted in bitterness, which then resulted in sin, which then resulted in death. So we have to be careful, my friend, because we all compare ourselves to other people, whether it's with our looks or our cars or our status or our age or our finances. And when we compare ourselves to other people, it will cause us to either become bitter or it will cause us to become a murderer. Now, I'm obviously kidding on that last part, but you get the point. So we have to be careful with comparisons. The second truth that we need to learn from this story is this: God sees the heart. God sees the heart. He sees the heart of those around us. And if we are not careful, we will judge other people by their actions, but God will judge us by our hearts. This is something that we need to keep in mind, because in Matthew chapter 23, verse 26, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he says this: "You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You fools and blind ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give his alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean." These religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they would wash the outside of the cup and the dish, but they never washed the inside. They never cleaned the inside. Why? Because they were concerned with appearances. Okay? They were concerned with what people thought of them, but they weren't concerned with what God thought of them. And if we're not careful, we will do the same thing. We will put on a good face, We'll pretend everything's okay, but on the inside we're bitter. We're harboring unforgiveness. We're harboring some anger. We're harboring some resentment. And if we're not careful, that bitterness will grow. What will happen is that eventually we will justify our actions. Eventually we will say things like, well, they did this to me. How was I supposed to react? How was I supposed to deal with that? I didn't have any other choice. Or we will say things like, well, everyone else did it too. Everyone else thought it was okay, so why not me? Or we'll say things like, well, everyone makes mistakes, right? Everyone messes up, so why shouldn't I be able to mess up once in a while? So we have to remember that God sees our hearts. He knows what's going on inside. We cannot deceive God. We cannot fool God. The third truth that we need to remember from this story is this: bitterness unchecked will always end tragically. Bitterness unchecked will always end tragically. And what happened to Cain? What was the result of his bitterness? Well, he was cursed, and his bloodline was cursed. And his bloodline carried this curse for generations. And that curse is this: whenever anyone killed one of Cain's descendants, they would be avenged sevenfold. In other words, if someone killed one of Cain's children, or one of his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren, whoever it may be, that person who did the killing would be killed, and they would be killed 7 times over. Now, this doesn't mean that they literally killed 8 people for every one that they killed, but it means that they were cursed. Their bloodline was cursed. And this is what happens when we allow bitterness to go unchecked, and we have to be careful. We have to deal with bitterness. We have to deal with anger. We have to deal with offense quickly, because if we don't, that bitterness will grow. And what happened to Cain? His punishment was that he had to wander around the earth, a fugitive for the rest of his life. He was a homeless person for the rest of his natural life, and he lived a life of isolation and loneliness, wandering around the earth, probably dying alone somewhere in the wilderness. And we have to remember that this guy had potential. This guy could have been the second person in the world to get to heaven. I mean, think about it. Adam and Eve were the first couple. If he would have been obedient, he would have been the second person to get to heaven because he was saved by faith. And we know that because in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, it talks about how, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous. So he was saved by faith. He had faith in God. He believed in God, and he received the promise of God. But because he was bitter, because he was angry, because he allowed his heart to be filled with envy and jealousy towards his brother, he lost it all. He lost his relationship with God. He lost his peace with God, and he lost his future in God. And we have to be careful that we don't do the same thing, my friend. Don't allow yourself to be overcome with bitterness, because bitterness will destroy you. It will destroy your family, and it will destroy your future.